Nobody at Mercy General knew that the woman who restocked the supply carts before dawn and ate lunch alone in the stairwell had once kept 3 men alive. With a tourniquet made from a shoelace and her own belt in a drainage ditch outside Kandahar. They just knew her as Tate, Vivian Tate. Trauma Bay 2, the nurse who never flinched when the gurneys came in bloody and fast on a Friday night, who could get a line in a collapsed vein in under 6 seconds, who sometimes stood very still in the supply closet for a moment longer than necessary before walking back out. The attending physicians liked her because she anticipated. The residents liked her because she didn't make them feel stupid. The other nurses liked her, mostly, though a few found her hard to read. She didn't come to the holiday party. She didn't share much about her weekends. She had a small apartment 20 minutes from the hospital and a dog named Silas, a brindle mutt with a torn ear. And those 2 things, the apartment and the dog, were about the extent of what anyone at Mercy General could tell you about Vivian Tate's personal life. That was exactly the way she wanted it. She was 34 years old, and she had been a civilian for 3 years. And some days that felt like a long time, and some days it felt like nothing at all. Some days she would be standing at the sink washing her hands, and she would look up at her reflection and genuinely not recognize the woman looking back at her. The scrubs, the badge clipped to her chest, the fluorescent lights overhead, and she would have to take a breath and remind herself where she was. Mercy General, St. Louis, Missouri, safe. She had learned to anchor herself in small details, the squeak of the supply cart wheels, the smell of the hand sanitizer, the weight of the stethoscope around her neck. These things were real and present, and they kept her here. In this hallway, in this life, she had carefully and deliberately built for herself on the other side of everything that had happened. She didn't talk about before. Not with anyone. The morning it started was a Tuesday in November, overcast and cold, the kind of cold that came in off the river and settled in your bones. Tate had worked the overnight and was finishing her notes at the station when the charge nurse, a heavy-set woman named Bowers, who had been at Mercy General for 19 years and had seen everything twice, appeared at her elbow. "You've got visitors at the front desk," Bowers said. Tate didn't look up from her screen. "I'm not expecting anyone." "I know, that's why I'm telling you." Something in Bowers's voice made Tate stop typing. She looked up. "They're asking for you by name," Bowers said. "Not your first name, your last. And there." She paused. "You should just come see." Tate followed her down the corridor toward the main entrance. The hospital was in that quiet between the end of night shift and the full momentum of morning, the waiting room mostly empty, a few chairs occupied by people who had been there all night with worry worn into their faces. She could hear the front doors before she could see them. The mechanical slide of the glass panels, a gust of cold air, footsteps. She turned the corner and stopped. There were 4 of them, all men. They were in civilian clothes, jeans, jackets, boots. But there was something in the way they carried themselves, in the particular stillness of the way they stood, that made the waiting room feel smaller. The man in front was maybe 40, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray at his temples and a jaw that had clearly been broken at least once. He was holding a piece of paper in his hand, folded and refolded enough times that it was soft at the creases. The man to his right was younger, dark-skinned, standing very straight, and Tate saw before she registered anything else that the left leg of his jeans was empty, below the knee, the pant fabric pinned. He was on a crutch. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. The man in front saw her, and something in his face changed. "Tate," he said. She heard her own voice come out very carefully. "Can I help you?" "My name is Strickland," he said. "Marcus Strickland. This is Hewitt, Orozco, and Ewan." He gestured to each man in turn. "You don't know us, but we know you. You saved all 4 of us in the Arghandab Valley in October of 2019. The waiting room was quiet. A woman near the window with a sleeping child looked up briefly, then away. Tate said, "I think you have the wrong person." Strickland didn't blink. "We don't." She took them to a family consult room down the hall, the one with the upholstered chairs and the box of tissues on the table. She closed the door. She stood with her back to it for a moment, looking at the 4 of them arranged in the small room. Strickland, Hewitt, who was the young one on the crutch, and the 2 others, Orozco and Ewan, who were sitting down now, quiet, watching her. "How did you find me?" she asked. "Took us a while," Strickland said. "You weren't easy to find. That was probably intentional." "It was. We weren't going to stop looking." She pulled a chair out and sat down across from them because she didn't trust her legs to keep holding her up the way she wanted them to. She had known in some theoretical way that this moment was always possible. She had never let herself think about it concretely. She had been very good at not thinking about it concretely. "October 2019, Strickland said. "We were 12 hours into an extraction that had gone badly wrong. Our team medic was down. We had 3 critical casualties, and Hewitt had a femoral bleed that should have killed him inside of 6 minutes. He paused. "You came out of nowhere. You were with a different element. We never knew what unit. You never said. You worked on Hewitt for 40 minutes in the back of a vehicle that was still moving. You told Orozco to hold a compress in place, and you talked him through it, and he did it, and you stopped the bleed." Tate looked at Orozco. He had a broad face, calm eyes. He nodded once, very slowly. "You stabilized 2 others, Strickland continued. "You stayed until the medevac came. Then you were gone." "I had somewhere to be," Tate said. The flatness in her own voice surprised her. Some old habit, the way she had learned to talk about impossible things in a calm register, the way emotion and operational reality had to be kept in separate rooms inside your head, or neither one worked properly. Strickland almost smiled at that. "We figured. You didn't have to come here," she said. "We know," said Hewitt. It was the first time the young man had spoken. His voice was lower than she'd expected. He was looking at his hands, folded in his lap. "We needed to." She found out over the next hour the parts she hadn't known. Hewitt was 26 now. He had lost the leg below the knee 8 months after the Arghandab Valley, a different mission, a different kind of bad day. He had been medically separated. He was living in Columbus, Ohio, studying criminal justice. He had a daughter who was 2 years old and had just learned to say dog and no with approximately equal enthusiasm. Orozco had gone back to San Antonio after his contract ended. He ran a food truck now, breakfast and lunch, parked outside a university 3 days a week. He showed Tate a photo on his phone of the truck, bright orange, stylized lettering, without her having to ask. "I'm a better cook than I was a soldier," he said, which is saying something, because I was a decent soldier. Ewan was still in. He hadn't said where he was currently stationed, and she didn't ask. There were places that information could and couldn't go, and both of them understood that implicitly. Strickland had a teenage son in Phoenix. He had been the team leader that night in 2019. He was the one, she understood gradually, who had organized this, had spent more than 2 years tracking her down through a process he didn't fully describe, some combination of people who owed him favors, and official channels that moved slowly, and records that were sealed, but not always sealed as tightly as they were supposed to be. She listened to all of it. She asked questions when she had them. She drank the cup of bad vending machine coffee that Yoon produced from somewhere and handed to her without comment. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in front of 4 soldiers in a family consult room at Mercy General. At 7:30 in the morning, she had been very clear with herself about this, even before she'd fully registered that it was a risk. When there was a pause in the conversation, she said, "You should know that I don't remember it the way you're describing it." Strickland looked at her steadily. "How do you remember it?" "I remember a lot of blood. I remember the vehicle moving and trying to compensate for the motion. I remember Hewitt's pressure being very bad and then less bad. I remember the medevac taking longer than it should have." She looked at the surface of the table. "I don't remember being someone who came out of nowhere. I was just the person who was there. That's all it ever is." Strickland said quietly, "The person who's there." She looked up at him. "We've been thinking about what to say to you for 2 years, he said. "We had a whole speech." Hewitt wrote most of it on the drive over, actually. It was very thorough. Hewitt made a sound that might have been a laugh. 3 drafts. And now that you're sitting here, I think maybe none of it was the right thing." Strickland leaned forward slightly. "So I'm just going to say the actual thing, which is that Hewitt's daughter is 2 years old and knows how to say dog and no, and she exists because of what you did in the back of that vehicle, and we needed you to know that. Not because you need the credit. I can see you don't want the credit, but because you should know that the thing you did is still going on. It's still alive. It's in a 2-year-old in Columbus, Ohio, who says dog and doesn't know your name yet, but I think someday she probably should." Bowers was waiting in the hallway when Tate came out. She had the good sense not to ask questions immediately. She just walked alongside Tate back toward the nurse's station, matching her pace, and waited. "Old friends," Tate said finally. Bowers said nothing for a moment. Then, "You don't have old friends. I do now." They reached the station. Tate sat down and pulled her notes back up on the screen. Her hands were steady. She had made them steady. There was a skill to that, steadying the hands, and she had been practicing it for a long time. "Tate," Bowers said. She looked up. Bowers was studying her with an expression Tate had seen her use on patients. Not pity, exactly, something more useful than pity. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that something real had happened to a person, and they were still standing up. "You want to take the rest of the morning?" Bowers asked. "No," Tate said. "I'm good." Bowers nodded. She looked like she had more to say and decided against it. She picked up her own chart and walked away down the hall. Silas was waiting at the door when she got home that evening, as he always was, with the particular urgency of a dog who has been alone all day and has strong feelings about this. She let him out into the small yard behind the building and stood in the cold. While he did his circuit of the fence line, nose down, tail moving in long, unhurried sweeps, she thought about Hewitt's daughter, 2 years old, saying dog. She thought about a vehicle moving through darkness in the Argandab Valley in October of 2019, and how she had not let herself think about that night in a very long time, because thinking about it fully meant thinking about everything around it, before and after, and that was a door she kept closed for good reasons. She thought about what Strickland had said. The person who's there. She had enlisted at 22, straight out of a pre-med program she couldn't afford to finish. She had done her training and gone where she was sent. and done what needed doing, which was usually medical and often terrible and occasionally impossible. And she had learned to fold the terrible and impossible into a small, dense shape and keep it somewhere internal where it didn't interfere with her hands or her mind or her ability to function in the space of a mission. She had learned this because it was required, because the alternative was not doing the job and the job had to be done. She had not learned to unfold it. That was the part no one taught you. 3 years out, she was still figuring out that part on her own. She had a therapist she saw every 2 weeks who was careful and competent and didn't push too hard, which Tate appreciated more than she could say. She had Silas. She had the rhythms of the hospital, the urgency of trauma, which was sometimes the only context in which she still felt fully like herself. She was beginning to understand, lonelier than she let herself admit. Silas came back to her across the dark yard and pushed his big head into her hip, and she put her hand on him and felt his warmth and the steady beat of his breathing. Strickland had given her a piece of paper before they left, a phone number, and below it, Hewitt's daughter's name, Adelaide. He'd said he'd cleared it with Hewitt's family if she ever wanted to reach out. No obligation, no expectation. Just an open door. She had folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket, and it was still there now. She was not the kind of person who called. She had not been the kind of person who called in a very long time, if she ever had been. Reaching toward people was a thing she had quietly stopped doing somewhere in the years of deployment and compartmentalization, and learning to be only as much as the mission required. But Adelaide was too, and said, "Dog." And Tate was standing in a cold yard in November with her hand on her dog's back, and she was still alive, which was not something she had always taken for granted, and she had a phone in her pocket, and a piece of paper with a name on it, and she was slowly recognizing nothing actually stopping her. She called 3 days later. Hewitt answered on the second ring. There was noise in the background. Cartoons, she thought, and the particular quality of a small space with a young child in it. He sounded surprised to hear from her. Then he sounded something else, something that took a moment to identify because it was simple, and she had gotten out of the habit of expecting simple things. He sounded glad. She talked to him for 40 minutes. She talked to his wife briefly, a woman named Roslyn, who had a direct, warm way of speaking that Tate immediately respected. She heard Adelaide somewhere in the background, not on the phone, just present. A small voice asking a question that Roslyn answered without breaking stride. When she hung up, she sat in her car in the parking garage of her building for a little while in the dark, not because she was upset, but because she needed a moment to absorb the weight of it. Not the heaviness of grief or loss, but the other kind of weight, the kind that feels like something solid has come back into your hands after you've been empty-handed for longer than you realized. She was not good at this. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She was not good at people, at letting them in, at sustaining the kinds of connections that most people built and maintained without thinking. She had lost the habit, or possibly she had never fully had it, and either way she was starting from something close to zero. But Hewitt had 3 drafts of a speech he'd written on the drive over, and Strickland had spent 2 years looking for her, and Adelaide said, "Dog." The next week, she told Bowers, not everything, not the details, because the details belonged to a world that Bowers didn't have clearance for and never would, and some of them still belonged to Tate alone. But enough. She said she'd served. She said it had been difficult to come back. She said some people she'd helped a long time ago had found her, and that it had been harder to sit in that room with them than most of the overnight trauma shifts she'd ever worked, and that she was still thinking about why. Bowers listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. "You know what I think?" Bowers said when she'd finished. "I usually don't want to know what you think," Tate said, "but go ahead. I think you've been carrying a thing that was meant to be shared, and it sat wrong in you all by itself." Tate considered this. "That's irritatingly accurate. I've been doing this for 19 years. I know a carried thing when I see one." In the weeks after, small things shifted. Nothing dramatic, nothing she could have pointed to and called a turning point. But Strickland texted occasionally, usually something dry and brief, the kind of communication she found easy to respond to. Orozco sent a photo of the food truck one morning with a caption that said, "Taco Tuesday. You're missing out," and she sent back a photo of the vending machine coffee she was drinking at 4 a.m. And he replied, "Okay, you win the suffering contest." Hewitt sent her a video one afternoon of Adelaide in the backyard with a neighbor's dog, a yellow Labrador roughly twice her size, and Adelaide completely unafraid, absolutely delighted, trying to explain something important to the dog in a language that was approximately 30% English and 70% Adelaide. Tate watched it 3 times. She showed it to Bowers, who watched it once and handed the phone back and said nothing, which was how Tate knew it had gotten to her. She was not fixed. She would have rejected that word even if someone had offered it. The things she carried were still there, still heavy, still requiring the small daily work of management that she had made into second nature. She still had the moments at the sink when the reflections stopped making sense. She still woke some mornings with the particular residue of certain dreams that she would not describe to anyone. But there was Silas. There was the work. There was Bowers, who had been watching her from 19 years of experience and had apparently seen something worth waiting for. And there was the fact that somewhere in Columbus, Ohio, a girl named Adelaide was learning the names of things, and one of the names she would eventually learn was the name of a woman she had never met, and that woman was. Tate was allowing herself to recognize this, slowly, with the care she applied to difficult procedures. Still here, still doing the work, still the person who was there. That felt, in the quiet arithmetic of her particular life, like enough. It felt, some days, like more than enough.